Where is God to be found? About 100 years ago, the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote these words: I find you, Lord, in all things and in all my fellow creatures, pulsing with your life. As a tiny seed, you sleep in what is small, and in the vast, you vastly yield yourself. The wondrous game that power plays with things is to move in such submission through the world, groping in roots and growing thick in trunks and in treetops, like a rising from the dead. Yesterday, I came across an old journal that I kept when our son was a 1-year-old, and it brought such joy to my heart to remember those ways in which God felt so present in those days. I wrote this: Micah is drinking bathwater now. He downs it like a pot-bellied Monday night football fan at the local tavern. Then he stands up and he coughs. I go on to describe finding him under the microwave oven, eating through a plastic bag, a 40-pound plastic bag of russet potatoes. He'd actually gotten to one of the potatoes and eaten probably about an eighth of the potato. It was a pleasure to be drawn back to moments like that. God seemed so present to us in those days of discovery for me as a parent and for him as a new human being. James Finley offers a vision for what he calls a contemplative way of life, a form of existence that recognizes God at the center. Contemplation means really looking and paying close attention to things. Perhaps I had more of a chance to do that when I was taking care of small children. After all, most of what we experience, we notice only in passing as we are on our way to something else. But every so often, we find reason to pause. Something catches our eye, and then suddenly, we are immersed in a deeper reality. We encounter what is right in front of us, a field of spring Presidio wildflowers, the billions of worlds in the summer night sky, the seemingly infinite, calm, dark September waters off Point Bonita, the unexpected sound of a cricket in our city, or the joy of children playing. Now, although these are absolutely ordinary things, in each case, something has broken us out of our web of worries and judgments that usually dominate our inner life. These moments of openness almost seem to come before thought. Suddenly, we become conscious, in Finley's words, that we are the cosmic dance of God. The fullness of being completely in God surprises us. And then we might find ourselves wondering, what do I do now? Often it's just nothing. Our cell phone summons us, or we have a new version of an old worry that arises in our minds and our thoughts. But when we look back at times like this, we know that they felt like a sort of homecoming. We belong there. Finley says, quote, when you start understanding your life in light of these moments, you realize this feeling that you're skimming over the surface of the depths of your own life. It's all the more unfortunate because God's unexplainable oneness with us is hidden in the depths over which we are skimming. And so in our disappointment, we say something to ourselves like, I don't like living this way. I don't want to be separated from the place where I most experience God's love. I want to abide with God always. Moses lived in an untenable political situation. The Pharaoh had ordered his people to murder all the Hebrew children who were male. And Moses' parents, they abandoned him in a basket of reeds He was discovered by a princess and raised in the royal family. And as he came to consciousness of who he was, who his peoples were, he saw a Hebrew who was being harassed by an Egyptian, and he killed the Egyptian. The Hebrews weren't pleased by it, stirring up things. The Egyptians certainly weren't. And he had to flee as a murderer, as a refugee. And he lived with his father-in-law. And I only this week realized what that means. For years and years, like living with your father-in-law, we still know what that means today, right? A relationship of dependence. And he was out with his father-in-law's flock when he saw something that caught his eye. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a bush that was blazing but not consumed. And Moses said to himself, I must turn aside and look at this great sight. And then God describes this wonderful plan of liberation for the Israelites, just what Moses had wanted from the time he first came to consciousness. And Moses, he comically comes up with excuse after excuse after excuse for why God has gotten the wrong person. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I certainly have. I definitely identify well with Moses, except for the murdering part. That's the part I don't identify with. And God reassures him. God says, I will be with you, and you will have what you need when you go to see Pharaoh. And this is not enough for Moses. Finally, Moses says, what if the Israelites ask your name? And God replies, he says, tell them, I am has sent you, has sent me to you. And some interpreters, they suggest that this is kind of joke that we just don't get anymore. Maybe it's a joke that you get and I just don't get. Others, people say that it's a way of that's God's avoiding the question. But for me, this refers to that experience I described earlier, when our ego drops away and we are united to our Creator. It is the gratitude we feel for simply being alive and to the one who brought us forth out of nothing. Where is God to be found? In the I am, beyond thought, deep within both ourself and the world. I spent the first part of the summer in heaven reading Catherine Sonderegger's first volume of her systematic theology. I'm looking out for you. For a few of you, that would be heaven. For many of you, it might not be. But it was such a joy. For her, this story of Moses at the burning bush lies at the heart of her understanding of God. She begins with the idea that God is one. God is absolutely unique. Nothing is like God. We cannot think something that is absolutely unique. And so Sonderegger points out that for this reason, the reality of God, especially for us in modern times, is hidden. She uses the word omnipresence to describe God. And it does not just mean that God is everywhere. It also means that most often we fail to perceive God. She says that nature, in a sense, hides God, and that in our time, atheists help us to more deeply appreciate the hiddenness of God. That, quote, even in indifference and defiance, they, in a sense, glorify God. Now, she says that it's not just that modern universities fail to teach about God, their methods have become secularized. And she calls this methodological atheism. She defines it as, quote, the conviction that God cannot be a reality or dimension in the principled means of knowledge in the modern intellectual world. And indeed, I would not want my rheumatologist or a Federal Reserve Bank economist appealing to God in their academic papers. It would be weird, but it would also be inaccurate. We do not learn about God through the scientific method because God is not a thing like the other things we encounter. God is not an object of our thought the way that an apple is. God does not stand open and static in that way to our faculties, waiting noiselessly to be discovered. And yet, God will stand open to our knowledge of Him as truth. So you might be thinking and wondering, how does this happen? And at this point, Sonderegger compares our experience with God with our relationships with one another. Unlike inanimate objects, human beings disclose ourselves to others. We know that the people we meet have an inner life, and they show it to us in their words and actions. Sonderegger writes, "We must speak or give ourselves away in gesture or act of kindness or savage cruelty or deep intimacy." This morning, I'm sharing with you who I am right now as I reflect on what it felt to be a new parent. So Sonderegger writes, God is Lord of our knowledge of Him, that in humility and like human beings, God chooses to share Himself with us. One of her favorite ideas is that God is not something that's a paradox or alien to the universe or the world around us. God is compatible to the world. And this is part of the importance of Moses' burning bush. God is with us. We don't experience all of God. There are many aspects of God that we'll never understand, but God gives us a kind of transcendence in the way that the bush is burned but not consumed. God draws near to us, and yet the creatures who experience God, we still live. We're not destroyed. God is invisible and mysterious, utterly other than us, and yet also in our midst. We know God in our inner experience. Now, I want to just mention two footnotes because the reading from Romans is so powerful and the gospel is too. And one of the things I want to point out about Romans, I want to remind you, this is your challenge for the week. This is your homework that you're going to take away today. Paul says, never, beloved, never avenge yourself. Now, it's a really hard thing to do. It's almost like an itch that we want to scratch so badly. So my instruction to you is try not to avenge yourself this week. And Paul also writes about extending hospitality to strangers, and he uses the word philoxenia, which is love of strangers. So philoxenos, right? And so love of strangers is philoxenia. And then the word that's related to that in our English language is xenophobia, right? So learn to love the stranger and not hate the stranger. And he asks us to avoid vengeance, to embrace the stranger, because so often we encounter God in moments like this. So when Jesus says, those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it, the word he uses is not life, but soul. We lose our soul when we miss opportunities to care for other people and to see the burning bush in our life. Now, so far in all our time together, many years now, I've never shared with you any poetry that I've ever written. And this morning I did at the 8:30 service, and I was resolved to never do it again. And Mary Carter Green said, "No, Malcolm, you should try it again." And so Mary Carter is such a dear friend. I'm very grateful for her. So here's my poem about Micah riding in the backpack when he was 1 year old through the woods in New England. In the sorrowing rain, together we walk through wet autumn grasses, from New England meadows into silent woods and the brooding dark. With each spongy step, I feel your weight shift further over in the backpack until I know you are asleep. I worry that the damp mist will make you cold. In the corner of my eye, I see your soft angel face under the navy hood. Your tiny hand touches my back just beneath the shoulder. I listen for your breath and want to wake you from all death. The fog brings everything closer in, the yellowed ferns and ancient bark, a million diamond drops on the hemlock needles, until we leave the grasping roots of the pine hill for the burning colors of the lowlands. We step through the swamp on a thin crimson carpet of maple leaves. The gold leaf ceiling above our head burns with perfect brightness through the gray day. The light illuminating these trees seems to come from inside. I stop to pray, my boots sinking in black mud. Thank you, God, for all you have given us that we never could see before. There is only one reason that I am speaking to you today. There is only one thing that I need to remind you. Seek God. Do not just skim over the surface of the depths of your own life. Turn aside and look at this great sight. I Am has sent you. So step away from the web of worries and judgments into a deeper reality, into the cosmic dance of God. Help us find you, Lord, in all things and in all our fellow creatures.